Okay, well, good evening. Nos Waita. Welcome everybody to what is, I think, already the third one of our public lectures of a series, and they come thick and fast. We have a really exciting and interesting one and a fascinating one this evening. So Professor Alison McMillan is going to be addressing us very shortly. And just to introduce Alison, I'm sure many of you know her already, but what she's going to share with us this evening will be quite compromising and quite challenging, I would say. So Alison is Professor of Aerospace Technology. She previously worked in the aerospace industry before she joined academia. In recent years, she's been following the research and development and marketing promises of leading aerospace companies. Promises is the key word there. Whether they deliver is, of course, another question. So Alison has struggled to reconcile those promises with both COVID safety research and net zero goals. In the last 2 years, Alison has been leading a transdisciplinary discussion forum called For the Relief of Our Planet, which has discussed science research, societal equality, and the importance of trustworthy information. So I really look forward to Alison to share with us this evening.
Thank you very much. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. First of all, I'd like to give some acknowledgements. Many of the ideas and conclusions to be presented tonight arose through the course of discussions during the Bacon 2020 project and the follow-on for the Relief of Our Planet activity. And this led to a series of 10 online seminars, and the recordings of which are available on this link. These discussions were of a transdisciplinary nature and involved members of staff from across the Faculty of Arts, Science and Technology at Glyndwr, some of our visiting professors and researchers, members of the Institute of Physics in Wales and the Institute of Physics History and Physics Group, and a number of other parties as well. And I would also like to acknowledge the Global Association for Transition Engineering. So, if you consider your everyday life, almost everything you do and use has been influenced or enabled by engineering or related disciplines. From the obvious things like the car that you drive, the bridge you cross, the pervasive electricity and water supply to every home, and even the modest stainless steel cutlery that you use, all of this involves engineering knowledge to provide and to maintain as cheaply and efficiently as possible. And engineering is more than the everyday. It is central to the development of new machines, medical devices, manufacturing machines, space telescopes, and all the wonderful new technology and structures and machines that will help us to overcome the climate change catastrophe and carry on living in the manner to which we've become accustomed. Except that is what the marketing narrative of the big engineering businesses expect us to believe. The reality is rather different. Machines that suck carbon dioxide out of the air are feasible, but do they do it at the scale that would make a real difference? Aircraft engines that run on electricity or hydrogen are feasible for some specific applications, but not for mass transportation to the Costa del Sol. We are told to have high expectations of nuclear power, and the small modular reactors will save the day. But perhaps they might give us 30 years here and now, but what is the legacy to our grandchildren? Meanwhile, the technologies and lifestyle changes that could make the necessary impact at scale are being underdeveloped, mismanaged, or being subjected to a disinformation attack. And the public, you and me, is left confused and bewildered with no clear idea of planning for the future. What is required is a new type of engineering. And I'll go into this in quite a lot of detail. That's the whole purpose of the talk tonight. where we recognise that people, and indeed the biosphere, are part of the machine or structure that we design. So I'm not talking now about cars or aircraft. I'm talking about the planet as a machine, and that the humans, we need to be engineering that. And that's obviously not the skill set of engineers, not just the skill set of engineers, but we have some skills that can come to that. So designing the changes in lifestyles and the way we use machines and structures to support that is called transition engineering. And even that is not sufficient. We have to rethink what we mean by economy and government as the simplistic drivers of money, so profit, wages and taxation, will not ensure the needs of the common good are met. In conclusion, engineering can and will play a large part in tackling the challenges ahead, but it cannot do this in isolation. There will also need to be some radical changes in societal leadership and a far more honest review of the potential of the technologies being developed in the name of net zero. We cannot afford to play politics, we must work engineering. So let me set some context. I'm an engineer, and for a large part of my career background, I've been in aerospace engineering. And yet here I am talking about matters that go well beyond engineering, about matters that are arguably beyond my experience and expertise. But we all do that when we talk to our friends, discussing the issues of the day and trying to set the world to right. What I intend to do tonight is to frame the climate change issue and related issues around my outlook and personality type as an engineer, and around the knowledge and expertise that engineers can bring in general to the general and specific problems. So general and specific problem solving. So people define engineering, or the purpose of engineering, in different ways. For example, the Institution of Mechanical Engineers describes engineering as improving the world through education. So, through engineering. The Royal Academy of Engineering says, harnessing the power of engineering and technology to build a sustainable society and an inclusive economy that works for everyone. And the Institution of Engineering and Technology says, working to engineer a better world. Even Sir Francis Bacon, writing 400 years ago, set out an imperative for the advancements of scientific knowledge, for the relief of man's estate. And in modern times, given the extent of our knowledge and the impact of our way of living is having, the estate can be understood to mean our planet. Personally, I rather like B'Elanna Torres' comment, and B'Elanna is a character from the Star Trek Voyager series. It may be the warriors who get the glory, but it's the engineers who build societies. In each of these statements, there is a goal that concerns the world or the society that inhabits it. And so, in a similar spirit, my definition is engineering creates the infrastructure that enables a civilization. So I'm thinking beyond the usual confines. Engineering isn't only designing and manufacturing things like cars, aircraft, and the infrastructure for washing machines or space telescopes, or building structures like bridges and railways and tunnels and towers, or mining, or generating and distributing power, or creating products like chemical products and food at scale, although each of these does require specialist engineering expertise. These are the nitty-gritty details of engineering. These are the skills and know-how needed at the detailed end of the process, the how to do it side of making stuff. And I know I am here speaking as an aerospace person, and many of you are expecting to hear about aerospace engineering specifically in this talk, but it will come. But first, I want to set the scene and say some very generic things about engineers and about people and how we all view the world that we live in. So coming back to this, we mustn't reach straight into the details. First, we need to decide, as a society or civilization, and that means all of us, all of you, what is it that we need the engineers to make and build? I'm pretty sure that for most of you who have read the flyer for this talk and have come along tonight, the one overarching question is this one. How should engineering, or we as people, rise to the challenges of climate change to preserve our continued existence? So I'm setting aside all those other questions that we see and read so much of. Should I get an electric car? Or how and when will hydrogen be introduced as a household fuel? And what needs to be done to enable renewable energy sources like solar and wind power to provide a sufficiently continuous supply of energy? What is net zero? And does offsetting work? Or is it a gimmick? And yes, we might believe in any one of the ideas and concepts that appear in the media and in advertising material as technically possible as a one-off. But is it feasible or even sensible at scale? And by at scale, I mean all of it, pervasive everywhere. These are details questions, and generalists, some specialist engineers will address them. And for example, David Sprake, who's here in the audience, he's going to be speaking here at the university on the 6th of December, next Tuesday, as an IMechE hosted public lecture, and again on the 19th of January as part of this Glyndwr public lecture series. He'll be speaking on this sort of aspects. But I want to come back to a general point. If engineering creates infrastructures for civilizations, what sort of infrastructure do we need now? Can we imagine it? Each of us might have a different vision, but if we share our visions and share our questions, then maybe a shared vision will emerge. But I'm worried that this will not be the case because there's very little society-level framing being done. And what do I mean? Let me take it for instance. There was a change to petrol supplied at forecourts about a year ago, September 2021, and the change related to the percentage of added renewable ethanol, so it went up to 10% of per volume of the diesel, and of petrol, and the new grade of petrol is called E10. Yes, there was information on the government website. Yes, there was media articles about it if one searched online, but I didn't see very much of a campaign to inform people about the change in advance, nor did I see any educational information about the reason for the change, nor about the implications like the change in fuel economy or the pricing. Yet petrol engines have been designed to run on E10 since 2011, so there's been plenty of time to provide public awareness. It just hasn't been pervasive. It was as if communicating with motorists was not a matter of importance. If one thinks back to the years leading up to year 2000, when leaded petrol was banned, I recall the argument about the dangers of leaded petrol since my earliest childhood. So I'm going back to the mid-60s. Unleaded petrol became available in the late 1980s, and it became the dumb thing to insist on buying a car that could run on unleaded as soon as it became affordable to do so. It was a necessary period of transition, and an inevitable one too. There had been 20 plus years of public narrative about the evils of lead in petrol. The change was coming and everyone knew it, even small children. That's even me in 1970. Everyone wanted it and everyone was waiting for it. Affordability was an important point, but not everyone can afford a new car, but some can. So it takes a few years for the new cars to enter the second-hand market, and eventually all second-hand cars ran on unleaded. But what I do not see now in regard to climate change-related actions is this level of expectation. I think there's a failure of leadership and a failure of imagination. And we could all wonder why. We all wait for a realistic understanding of how we're going to phase out fossil fuels. Actions seem to be piecemeal, and it's unclear, at least to me, whether they're scalable. Actions that are taken by individuals, like installing solar panels, have been incentivised, but only up to a point, and there's a lack of transparency about the future direction. And the same could be said about house insulation and heat pumps and so on. And yet, given that new build houses, which can surely be designed to maximise the value of all fuel-saving features, they're still being built without proper consideration of insulation, solar panels, and so on as standard. And why not? Because there's a lack of legislation, a lack of empowered demand. I mean, are people buying new houses insisting on it? If at governmental level there's little evidence of forward thinking and of addressing significant problems, then what messages does that send to us? Throughout the course of this talk, I shall speak about engineers and about us, you and me in the audience, and us, the members of the Bacon 2020 and the Relief of Our Planet team, and us, human beings on planet Earth. I'm going to avoid too much engineer speak, and I'm going to refer to fiction, to books, films, and TV series, stories that help us to imagine different realities and different futures, and inhabited by people, not necessarily humans, but who remind us of ourselves. And I think it's important to be feeding that information. After all, too much work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. But we silo education, particularly at tertiary level. Students study science or engineering, and students study the arts. Here at Wrexham Glyndwr, we have a faculty that straddles both, not STEM, that's science, technology, engineering and maths, but STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts and maths. One of the important aspects of the transdisciplinary teamwork for me was to have the mirror held up so as to see other people's perceptions of the things I knew about as an engineer, and to find a way to understand and communicate the human-facing aspects and the consequences more effectively. So, what are engineers? Well, let's move on and think about engineers. And here I really want to focus on the core aspects of engineers, not our individual and specialist knowledge, but what characterises us. There are some pretty obvious characteristics of engineers, given that our educational formation is strongly based around maths and sciences, and our field of activity is practical and tangible. And it's to be expected that engineers are logical and analytic and recognise details, and they're knowledgeable about science and its applications, and they're problem solvers. But there's another aspect of mental makeup that also tend to go hand in hand with these types of skill, such as introspectiveness and almost excessive focus on precision and attention to detail. And as well as this, I'm talking about aspects in a person that come under the heading of neurodiversity. In designing a safety-critical machine, precision and attention to detail are an absolute must. And people like engineers with a strong capacity for identifying patterns and affinity for numbers can also be introverted, prefer their own company, and have other personal preferences that seem unusual to other people. And this can include, diagnosed or not, traits such as Asperger's and the autistic spectrum, dyslexia, and so on. the issue is that while the doing of the engineering job requires the kind of mind that does engineering well, there is a communication or leadership need to present the engineering work to a wider audience. Further, that the characteristics of engineers, being what they are, it is rare that the engineers themselves have the opportunity to communicate directly. And this is what I mean by compartmentalised. Engineers are told things like, you're a talented engineer or a stress engineer or whatever, and it would be a waste to have you as a manager. And from there, the engineer's personal development is channeled and limited to the development of their particular skill set and away from developing comfort in leadership and communication, which is a loss. And I need to say some more things about compartmentalisation. If you read old adventure or sci-fi books, like by people like Neville Shute or Robert Heinlein, the skilled engineer is often described as one of the backroom boys. In other words, the brains that develops the essential piece of equipment, but who is kept in the back room and not encouraged to speak to anyone influential. And these storylines inevitably find a way for the backroom boy to interact with some disastrous situation and save the day, but not without having first had some sort of diplomacy faux pas, and that's necessary to the storyline to add tension and interest. So, in reality, and all the engineers here will probably agree with me, engineers are often very good team players, extremely helpful and supportive of each other and nurturing to younger members of the team. And many engineers will answer the call to be STEM ambassadors and give their time freely to encourage young people to study sciences at school and at university. It seems strange to me that engineers, on the one hand, recognise the need for increasing the number of future science and engineering professionals, even to the extent of giving their own time for free to engage and convey this message. And remember, it is a political message. It's the stuff of the white papers and the importance of manufacturing to the UK economy. And yet, I'm not so clear how effectively the communication from engineers is passed back to industry leaders and government. Well, to be honest, I know something of the process. Each of the professional engineering institutions will decide, separately or together, to write some lobbying statement. Such a statement has to be written very carefully, because to make any mistake in judgment would have disastrous consequences. And there might be a survey of opinion from the membership of the institution, but there are bound to be conflicting opinions, and minority views might be missed out, or simply not understood in the context. In doing so, the strength and the richness of opinion is filtered out. So let's come back and think again about the richness of opinion. And this is one of the more significant arguments for equality, diversity and inclusion. For a long time, this has focused on increasing the number of women in engineering, because if there were equal numbers of women and men in engineering, it would almost double the number of engineers. These days, there is a greater focus on the value of diversity in lived experience and removing barriers for those, not just for gender, but for BAME, LGBTQ, neurodiversity, disability, and socioeconomic circumstances. And as a university, Wrexham Glyndwr is a standout example of this. And again, for the 5th year running, I think, ranked number 1 in England and Wales for social inclusion. So the idea that increasing diversity within a group of people, there is a possibility of a richer outcome. So let's take another example from the fantasy literature. You might recognise the name. This is from Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Most of the protagonists are male, but they represent different species. There are men, elves, dwarves, wizards, ents, and hobbits. And the hobbits are frequently overlooked as being the smallest and the weakest, but they turn out ultimately to be the greatest heroes. The Nazgul king is second only to evil Sauron as the most evil being in the story, and is under a spell of protection so that he cannot be killed by a man. And by man, it's intended to mean human. There were 2 warriors at the battle who were expressly forbidden to take part in it. Eowyn, who was a human princess, and Merry, who was a hobbit. While Eowyn's slaying of the Nazgul king looks at first glance as a victory for womankind, she's still a human. The blow that broke the spell of protection was made by the hobbit Merry. And this victory was a team victory enabled by diversity. So now I come to thinking not just of engineers, but to all of us and all of our opinions. We, as a population, are even more diverse than we, and that is me and other engineers, or we, that is everyone here in this room. There is a far richer lived experience and a far richer set of knowledge and skills. So if we turn back to the previous question, and we modify it, how should we rise to the challenges of climate change to preserve our continued existence? And isn't this just like a customer-supplier discussion? The customer specifies what the product needs to be able to do. The supplier presents options that might fulfill some or all of those requirements. And then there's a two-way discussion about the feasibility and cost of the options. Not as a battlefield, but to ensure that the customer understands and makes an informed decision. Customer, all of us. And it comes down to this. What does the new infrastructure for civilization look like, and how do we get from here to there? And do I know all the answers to that? No, but I know some of the answers. Do politicians know all the answers? Industry leaders? Nobody knows all the answers, but each of us knows some of the answers, or can imagine what some of the answers should look like for us individually. Now, I'm showing you a blank slide deliberately, and I'd like you to stop and think. To take away every preconception that you have about how your daily life works and how it could work. The place we're trying to get to is a daily life that uses less energy, less fossil fuels, obviously, but using less energy would lead to this. And also consider your happiness. What things give you the greatest pleasure, and do these things require energy to be expended? What gives you satisfaction in your life? And what gives you dissatisfaction, and what can be changed? And would changing it have a negative impact on somebody else? So I'll give you a few moments to think. When we set out the ideal civilization, this is what we should be aiming for, I think. Okay. I'm introducing here Maslow's hierarchy, and we can talk about the basic needs of life in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I imagine that most people here would consider themselves somewhere towards the top of the pyramid. And I think this model summarises quite well what we want for everybody. it could be a validation test for whatever we might imagine for our new infrastructure for civilization. Now, I've mentioned before about core skills of engineers, and there's a tool called the 5 Whys, which is a thinking tool, and it originated in the manufacturing process improvement area, but it's a good tool for challenging fixed ways of thinking. The process of 5 Whys is to use the question why to challenge assumptions. And unfortunately my slide has gone slightly, I didn't animate it correctly, so it's the bit on the right hand side we're looking at now. So let's take an example and look at electric cars. We start with a statement, I want a car with an electric car with electric drive instead of a petrol engine. I want a like-for-like replacement of the car that I already have. And this is natural, and probably every car driver is having a similar thought. And then we challenge it with the question, why? To reduce carbon dioxide emissions, to use less fossil fuel, in other words, because of climate change. And some might say, I want this because it's a cost incentive. And then we might ask, why is there a cost incentive? Obviously to drive this behaviour. I don't want to go into all of that detail here, but you can imagine whys about the source of electricity to charge the car, the source of materials for the manufacturing industry, for manufacturing the battery, and there could be questions about the configuration of the car regarding engineering factors like centre of mass and how the wheels are going to be driven. But let's keep this focus on the needs of the driver, so we stay outside of the details. And so say, well, why does the driver want a car? And obviously the answer is because that person wants to be able to go to places. And again, we can ask why. And the most significant answer is likely to be to go to work. The use of more why questions would probably yield usual answers, having enough money to live, job satisfaction and those sorts of things. But there are already trends emerging with a greater demand for working from home, and much of that has been enabled by the challenges posed by COVID and addressed in the last couple of years. But I don't want to think about that. I want to go to another opening question. Why travel alone? And this is about the idea of personal transportation rather than public transport. And more people are asking this question of themselves about making the transition from using the car to using public transport for regular journeys and going to work. And yes, some people will walk or go by bike, and some will switch to public transport, but for a large number of people this is simply not feasible. Either the distances are too far, or public transport is inadequately joined up to make the journey possible. And there are so many other sides to personal transportation that could easily be explored, but here's a really important one. Road safety. Years ago, I signed up for the National Highway email alerts about road closures, and this is an example of that. It's not unusual to receive about half a dozen such alerts a day. Some are closures for scheduled repairs, and sometimes it's for a police-led event, but mostly it's because of a collision or a vehicle fire or emergency repairs to the highway after that. And that's depressing reading. Daily collisions, some with loss of life, and all implying 60 or 90-minute journey time lost by thousands of car drivers caught in the tailback. By comparison, rail and air travel is significantly safer. And this is an inconvenient truth that we never speak about. It brings me back to the question of planning appropriate infrastructure infrastructure that serves the needs of a civilization. I mean, all people within the civilization, not just the businesses, not just those with money, not just those who can afford to make choices. And don't we all deserve a reasonable, designed-in level of safety in our civilization infrastructure? Now, again, I'd like to pause and consider again the reasons why we do the things we do. I imagine everyone here believes that climate change is an issue and recognises the imperative for reduction in carbon dioxide emissions to contain the extent of change to remain within limits. We don't need to be climate scientists to believe the general messages, and we recognise that doing our bit is the right thing to do, necessary to limit the number of species extinctions and fair to other people in other places and countries that are more susceptible to the effects of climate change. Indeed, we probably all recognise that it's necessary for the survival of our own children and grandchildren. And yet, we still drive our cars. And whether they're fossil-fuelled or bioelectric is by the by, as the energy to build and ship them, as well as the electricity to power them, must still be generated. And even if all of that energy were renewable, that is taking renewable energy that couldn't be used for something else. So, and we still run our heating, we take our baths, we wash our clothes, and perhaps to an extent there's more to do with comfort than need. And coming back to the aerospace industry, we all expect to go on holiday, the same sorts of holidays that we have got used to going to, the city breaks to Europe, a week in the sun in Greece or in the Canary Islands, or a long-haul trip to the Americas or Australia. So on the one hand, we know and we understand the climate change messages, but on the other, there are still the societal expectations that drive us to continue to use energy. And this leads to cognitive dissonance. We're presented with conflicting narratives which we're not empowered to resolve. We all live as members of society, as a civilization, and we all have awareness of social signals. And these include the official rules, the law, and the official pieces of information, government policy, and incentives to follow policy. And these include also the social narratives, our peer pressure, the collective beliefs and habits of people like us. Within any society, there's a multitude of communities, and each of these will overlap with each other. The important thing about the official channel is that the stronger and more pervasive the messaging, the more seriously one will take the message. Rationing fuel would be a strong message. Setting up apprenticeship training for home insulation fitting and keeping a public register of those with suitable qualifications would also be a strong message. We've had strong messages about COVID behaviours, so we know what strong messages look like. And I don't believe, and maybe you don't either, that we've had strong messages about the route to net zero. The important thing about narratives is that when we associate ourselves with narratives, they become a kind of description for meaningfulness for our lives. The why we think what we think and the why we do what we do. The narratives are a sort of shortcut statement for our ethics and who we are. Of course, we can challenge and change our narratives, and the process of moving into adulthood is precisely the process of developing and validating the narratives we adopt that are different to those of our parents. And this is wrapped up in the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. The child needs access to a multitude of narratives and to know that it's okay to be different. But the lack of strong official messages and the conflict of the narrative means that we have a problem with resolving conflict. in our understanding. And not being able to resolve conflict is a source of stress. So we need an official narrative to tell us what the future looks like, and we need to be involved in discussions so that we can plan without fear for what our future looks like for us. So we need to plan our future individually. In other words, it's for government and other leaders in powerful positions to set out a credible shape for the direction forward. And we need to be involved in this, to shape the details that impact on us and to provide for the benefits of our knowledge, insights, needs, and so on, to make sure that the shape of the future is fit for purpose, so that we do not fear the future, but we recognise it's coming and how the threats of potential change will be resolved. And any future shape will have a multitude of niches, so we might want to think about aligning ourselves to a particular one. For example, making a career choice based on a good understanding of demand, what the demand for that career will be, and the locations where people with that career can live and work. Other factors might be the availability of renewable energy for large-scale manufacturing, or a need to depopulate areas where frequent flooding will become inevitable. So we need to think about our futures and what we're going to do and how we're going to adapt towards those futures. And that's a bit I think is absolutely missing at the moment. And I'd also like to say that we should forgive ourselves for feeling of guilt and inadequacy. For many of us, this cognitive dissonance is enough to deny belief in climate change. As after all, if the government isn't seen to take it seriously, then can it be serious? And for those of us who do take it seriously, understanding our feelings and those of others can be helpful. Maybe it can help us individually to formulate more effective actions. So I'd like to come back to the question of the engineering profession and what the engineering profession can do, and I'd like to introduce the concept of transition engineering. And with the level of infrastructural changes that are going to be required and the speed at which they need to be implemented, this doesn't look like an incremental transition. Small changes are not going to work. It's going to have to be big and soon. Yes, new central heating boilers are hydrogen ready, and renewable energy is feeding a substantial fraction into the grid, and there is some investment in railway infrastructure and city transport systems. But if we think about the 5 whys again, we might recognise that some of these preparations don't get right down to the root question. For example, why do we see hydrogen as a housing heat source at national scale? Is it safe? Is it the best way? What are the alternatives? To maximise the utilisation of renewable energy, the key enabler is going to be energy storage. And what are the developments on this front? It would be great to see improvements in the rail infrastructure, but how well does this join up with the rural transport needs, and what is being planned? But I don't want to ask these nitpicky questions. I want to go right into the basics. So let's go to transition engineering. And the concept of transition engineering has been developed and championed by Professor Susan Krumdiek and Daniel Kenning, among others. And it's been going for about 10 years now, with the view that it should become a recognised discipline spanning engineering and engaging in a transdisciplinary manner beyond engineering. And they cite a precedent of the discipline of safety engineering, which was developed about 100 years ago in response to a factory fire in which many employees lost their lives. And if safety engineering could be developed as quickly in response to such a need, then so too can transition engineering. And there's a textbook and a master's level programme at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand has been developed and is beginning to be offered at other university institutions. As a discipline, this sits well alongside other aspects of engineering management, innovation, systems engineering, process improvement, design innovation, and so on, because it challenges the basics of why and places importance on solving the root problem. The main tool of transition engineering is the in-time tool. So we start with a schematic of resource use, perhaps carbon dioxide generation, over a period of time. And we can place history on that graph. And the passage to the present, and then we can think about scenarios for the future. But these are not the futures that we want. The ones with the scary levels of carbon dioxide. So let's plot the ideal future. The question is, of course, how do we get to the ideal future? And we can use a technique called backcasting. And backcasting is about working backwards from the ideal future so we can work out what the preliminary steps might be to be able to reach that future. It's an activity that requires imagination and intellectual freedom. It's an ideal area in which transdisciplinary facilitation could play an important part. And having established the steps and identified technology or infrastructural gaps, it's possible to start planning the projects that will provide the enablers. And each of these could be self-contained projects or they could be concatenated. But that's a matter of detailed planning for the experts to determine costs, timescales, and risks, and so on. But as that is put in place, then the transition process can happen. So finally, after having introduced a lot of ideas and concepts, I'd like to turn to the future of aerospace. I don't want to go into details about hydrogen or synthetic fuels. Lots of specialists are working on assessing the obstacles and developing plans for the research and development that would need to be undertaken. And there are many aspects here, and each could be a lecture in itself. But I want to go back to the 5 whys and the in-time thought processes. And there are 3 particular things that come to mind. Why do we want to fly? And this is a very simple question. You're probably thinking, I'm out of my mind. Flights have been grounded for temporary issues like 9/11 and volcano eruptions and even COVID. And these did an immense amount of disruption. And I'm not proposing anything so abrupt. But what I am wanting to do is to question the growth of the aerospace industry. Industry wants the growth and people like being able to fly. But it's an artificial bubble, driven by cost differentials between flight prices and rail. For example, short-haul flights within country. And perceived benefits for foreign tourism, which currently outweigh those for internal tourism. And perhaps the recent surge in air travel is a short-term result arising from the COVID restrictions. People are so glad that they can now finally go and take their holidays. In part, I wonder if the bubble will burst because of political pressures or consumer ones, or a combination of both. But I do think that if people think about their carbon footprint, then they will increasingly think more carefully about the decision to fly, and unless or until there's a clearer narrative, there could be a downturn. Then there's a question of the narrative, and are narratives true? Let me explain what I mean. The industry wants to continue growth, and people are hungry to fly with a clear conscience. The messaging coming from the marketing, the social media feeds about new propulsion systems and new airframe concepts, they feed that hunger. Such messages are true in the sense that the information provided is true when read and understood by an expert. But how are those messages understood by others? The first flight of a single-seater electric aircraft might seem to be a first step in developing a new class of air ambulance, for example, but it doesn't readily scale into an electrically powered 150-seater commercial flight to Benidorm. And I think there's an ethical responsibility to ensure, as far as reasonably possible, that the received narrative, not the one that is presented, but the one that is received by the listener, that the perceived narratives industry creates are just as true for the non-specialist audience. And so if we do fly, why can't we continue to use fossil fuels? And again, I think you're going to lynch me. But the fly in the ointment is the terminology net zero. At one point, carbon offsetting and carbon sequestration were considered viable and realistic approaches to reducing fossil fuel, or at least reducing carbon dioxide. And in the aerospace industry, up until 10 years ago, when I left the industry, the drive was to improve efficiency by improved design and more capable materials. And it was predicated on the idea that flying was a special case and represented only a small percentage of the current carbon dioxide production. So I'm going to go out on a limb, and you're going to question my sanity, but hear me out. If we consider aerospace as one part of a total system, and that is the system of civilization rather than a system of its own, self-contained system, then the argument of special case makes more sense. Taken in the context that aerospace is deemed to be an essential part of a civilization, if that's the civilization that we want to design, what is more important, the overall efficiency gain or cutting the carbon dioxide production of one place in that system, one sector in the system? So for non-specialists in aerospace, you should note that the fuel in the fuel tank is a large fraction of the take-off weight of an aircraft. It's the limiting factor. So when you think of batteries are, so for an electric aircraft, batteries are so heavy that electric aircraft that are large and long-distance flight, and for long-distance flight, this isn't viable. There would need to be a huge leap forward in battery technology to be able to do this. And in theory, hydrogen has high energy density, but by the time you think about the storage and the safety systems that are required for the use of hydrogen as a fuel in aircraft, the increased weight of the aircraft would remove the weight benefit of the fuel. Then thinking about synthetic fuels, there is an energy cost in producing the fuel. And how does that compare with the fossil fuels that are used for the special case of flying? So I'm trying to say that there is a balance here, that the narrative is pushing us to expect net zero in aerospace, but I'm not sure it is the best way. In the long term, yes, of course, we have to stop using fossil fuels, but can we buy time to do better later? In terms of transition engineering, there's an analogue for what this could look like. For example, if we wanted to build a complete public transport network, we would need to build some more railway lines, and that would take time. So as part of the transition, so that there is an equivalent infrastructure in place, we could run buses on existing roads to fulfill the needs of the network. And this would mean that people could move to using public transport and make their personal transition, despite the fact that buses are slower, less safe, and less efficient. But they meet the infrastructural need for the present time, and so enable the process of transition to begin. So for air travel, do we need to plan for a transition to an air transport that is perhaps only for people and urgent goods? Do we need to look to more futuristic means of travel, so nuclear fusion powered aircraft? Or change the idea completely and look at something like luxury airship holidays. And while all this unfolds, remember the aerospace industry is full of manufacturing, engineering, design, and leadership talent, and these are very transferable. So there's going to be a market for rail vehicles and infrastructure, renewable energy equipment, nuclear power, energy protection structures, environmental protection structures, and so on. And an example of this is the way in which Rolls-Royce repositioned itself as a power company and entered the nuclear power business. Companies in aerospace could develop sideways in this way and build the skills and maintain their profitability and be ready to develop the next generation solution. My honest view about the aerospace industry is that I don't know enough, and all I can do is watch from the outside. I imagine that there are some considerable commercial sensitivities, and in the fullness of time, the logic behind all of this will become to make sense. But these are difficult times, and in difficult times, people will ask difficult questions, and that is the question that I posed right at the beginning. Is it too much to ask for a transparency about the direction of travel? And we all need to know where we're going before we can feel confident about getting on board. So finally, I'd like to bring up an appendix and talk to you about why I worry about hydrogen. Hydrogen is currently seen as the next fuel source. It's going to save our bacon. And the logic goes as follows. Excess power generated by renewable energy sources can be diverted into splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen, and the hydrogen is then a form of stored energy, and it can be burnt, recombined with oxygen to give water vapour and heat, and it's a cycle. And this is a very nice narrative. Hydrogen burns without creating carbon dioxide, and it can be a byproduct of overproduced renewable energy. Some serious practical concerns. So safety and storage, the volume and pressure of storage, the problem of leakage, and the efficiency of the cycle of splitting it, burning it, and producing the water vapour and so on. And there's the problem that from the point of view of the aerospace propulsion fuel, although there's no carbon dioxide produced, there will be water vapour produced, and this is another greenhouse gas, and it's being pumped out into the atmosphere, so the upper atmosphere. And there are some obvious engineering problems that the engineering problem solvers will look at and address. But there's one more fundamental problem that I think isn't getting sufficient attention. Any hydrogen that leaks in as gas into the atmosphere will eventually leave the planet. And hydrogen leaks extremely easily through all materials because it's such a tiny molecule. So how much you try to store hydrogen, it will leak. And planet Earth is a very small planet, and its gravity is insufficient to hold on to any hydrogen gas in the long term. We know that hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, and yet there's very little hydrogen in the Earth's atmosphere as gas. And the consequences of that is that if hydrogen is used as a fuel at scale, then there will eventually be a loss of water on the planet, because the hydrogen will not be burnt, it won't recombine to form water. And one would like to think that that would be an insignificant amount, but I don't believe it is. So if you think about our population trajectory over the next 1,000 years, say, and our power usage, And remember that the first world uses far, far more than the third world, and our population statistics for the first world are much, much smaller than the third world. So even then, if we assume the population and power needs remain constant, and they, of course they will not, and we assume hydrogen leakage rates are not improved, and we assume all future power is generated through burning of hydrogen, then I would estimate, and this is a back of the envelope calculation, so I need to do better, but I estimate a loss of water equivalent to about 2/3 of a centimetre or 3/8 of an inch on sea level. And to be clear, this isn't water tied up as ice on the polar caps, it's water lost from the Earth. So, I'd like to summarise. I asked, is it too much to ask? And I asked, how should engineering rise to the challenges of climate change to preserve our continued existence? And by this I meant that we should all have a role in specifying and validating plans for civilization infrastructural changes that engineering could enable. And my intention was to ask for transparency and better social inclusion with the issues of climate change, and to present some reasons why that is important. I see that all of us, all humans on Earth, have skin in this game. It matters to all of us. And some of us have the answers, and we might be engineers, we might use engineering, transition engineering as a tool, but we can also be artists and storytellers, or people who have different lived experiences, or who lived in different parts of the world, or as First Nation people have ancient knowledge handed down. And so, don't leave this to the experts. We all have a role to play in defining, planning and building an equitable and sustainable future for all